Let's begin. Good afternoon. My name is David Fott. I'm a professor of political science and director of the Great Works Academic Certificate Program here at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. The Great Works Academic Certificate Program exists to encourage undergraduates to spend as much time as they can with the greatest minds who have ever lived, whether they wrote prose, poetry, or both. A 9-page list of those minds can be found on the program's website. The program requires 12 credits of courses featuring primary sources written by authors on our 9-page list. It's a way to certify, if you're a student, an undergraduate, that you've taken rigorous courses, and it's a way to impress graduate schools and employers. I won't say more about the program now, but feel free to contact me uh, uh, particularly through email at david.fott@unlv.edu. I am particularly grateful that funding for today's lecture has come from a grant from the Teagle Foundation and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Our speaker today, Professor Rachel Hadas, is the author of numerous books of poetry, essays, and translations. Her most recent book of poetry, published last year, is Love and Dread. Her verse translations of Euripides' Iphigenia plays appeared in 2018. A selection of her prose, Piece by Piece, was published last year. A new book of poems, titled Pandemic Almanac, is due out this spring. The recipient of honors, including a Guggenheim Fellowship in Poetry and an American Academy Institute of Arts and Letters Award in Literature, she was a fellow at the Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers at the New York Public Library. Rachel Hadas is Board of Governors Professor of English at Rutgers University Newark, where she has taught for many years. Her topic today is Marooned in Space, Free from Time, Teaching Poetry in the Age of Zoom. If you have questions during the lecture, please type them into the chat feature of WebEx. And this lecture is being recorded. We ask that you please keep your cameras turned off throughout the lecture and use the chat feature to ask questions. We'll be happy Professor Hadas will be happy to answer just as many as she can. Professor Hadas, welcome.
Thank you so much, David. I'm happy to be here, and maybe it should be teaching poetry in the age of WebEx too, right? I'm not the greatest WebEx user, but I'll do the best I can. I'm very happy to be with you, and I wish I could be in Las Vegas in person. My husband and I had looked forward to the trip, but maybe another time. The technology is amazing and does enable this. And I did have a look at that 9-page list that Professor Thott mentioned last summer when he first invited me to come. And I was very impressed by it and found myself checking off things I had read, which was not most of the list. No one will have read everything on such a list. So I'm going to begin, and time definitely plays a part in what I'm going to be talking about. And I have a few little visual aids here. I have two hourglasses, which my students enjoy. This is 10 minutes, this is 15 minutes. I won't necessarily use them now, but we can also see the time on our screens. Then I have a kitchen timer, and I'm even wearing a watch. So my talk will be divided into 4 segments, which I believe could be presented in any order. The first segment is time. The second segment is sort of double-barreled. It is tools and techniques. The third segment is texts, so time, tools and techniques, texts, and the fourth section is pleasure. If you have the handout that I believe Professor Hay and Professor Fott have been handing out, great. If you don't, I'm sure you can see it later, but I'm not going to worry about screen sharing. Mostly I'll just be talking, but I'm sure that the handout will be made available. So first of all, time. We live in time. Academia certainly lives in time with semesters and midterms and all of these time sensitive denominations. Classes and lectures are scheduled, syllabi allot specific times. We've all become, in the last 2 years, familiar with time words like synchronous and asynchronous, words that nobody had even thought about, really, very much before 2020. And yet time in our pandemic era seems curiously slippery and elastic, as I'm sure many people have noticed. For the last 2 years, if anyone has counted, time has both been dragging and galloping. That's something I noticed when I was writing about caregiving for someone with a chronic illness, that time sometimes seemed to slow down and at other times seemed to speed up. Cut free somewhat from schedules, how do we fill our time? How do we divide our time? Do we slice each day into segments and just let the hours wash over us? Note that that question, that dilemma, metaphorically posits time first as a sliceable solid and then as a liquid. Just paying attention to the metaphors here. It's hard to know. A recent spate, another liquid word, of books have a journalistic shape, leveraging our day-to-day experience of time. Journal, of course, the French word jour for day. Journals shape something like a record, if not a narrative. A couple of prose books from this early crop of pandemic reporting or recording are a book called Year of Plagues by the British Guyanese writer Fred Daguiar, and 100 Days by Gabriel Josipovich, a British writer who decided early on that he would write one short essay a day for 100 days. My own pandemic almanac belongs to this general genre. Actually, it came out about a month ago. I should pull one up to the screen for you. And there are many, many others. Many writers, that is, have been keeping going by keeping track. But well before COVID changed the shape of our days and our schools, our relationship with time began to be seen as problematic. Slow down, we were told. Take your time. The slow food movement flourished. In our own bailiwick of academia, there have been books like The Slow Professor, published by a couple of Canadian academics 2 or 3 years ago, and a book I've greatly benefited for called Slow Reading in a Hurried Age by David Mikich. And the first page of the handout is David Mikich's 14 rules for slow reading. He doesn't say that these are pedagogical rules, but it seems to me they could be and should be. I'll just run down them quickly. And some of them are going to be more relevant than others. And for different students and teachers here, some of them might jump off the screen or the page for you, others might not. That's okay. Number 1, be patient. 2, ask the right questions. 3, identify the voice. 4, get a sense of style. 5, notice beginnings and endings. 6, identify signposts. 7, use the dictionary. 8, trace key words. 9, find the author's basic thought. 10, be suspicious. 11, find the parts. 12, write it down. 13, explore different paths. 14, find another book. I recommend Mikich's book, by the way, and I'll come back to some of these rules. Note that he doesn't say they're for teaching. They're valuable and pertinent, even if all you want to do is read. Reading and teaching literature overlap. Some of these rules are more applicable to certain texts than others, but they're all worth attending to. And since part of my talk is about pedagogy, whether you're in the student's or the professor's seat, I would add a few suggestions, maybe especially for our era, to Mikic's rules. All of the suggestions that I have, and I would be happy to talk more about them or to get more from you, have to do with drawing attention to a particular moment or passage in whatever we're reading, be it a lyric poem or an 800-page novel or philosophy or history. Imitate, juxtapose, memorize, dispute, invite guest lecturers to class. More on those guest lecturers later. Now, I'm not saying memorize a novel by Dostoevsky or by Fielding or by Proust, obviously, but very basic to my sense of pedagogy is finding a teachable moment and stopping there for a while, for as long as it takes. Mikic's most salient advice, be patient, use the dictionary, never spells out, but does seem to imply that less is more. Write that down, I say to my students, less is more. Long live synecdoche, the part for the whole. Better to begin by really digging into a text, even part of a text, than by skimming it and retaining very little or nothing. This is based on my own experience and on countless conversations I've had with colleagues. And it's the gist of an interesting essay that came out pre-pandemic in 2010 by Paula Marantz-Cohen, who is a critic and professor of English at Drexel University in Philadelphia. You can find it online. Her essay is called The Seduction, and it's really about how her teaching methods have changed. Cohen is probably my age, more or less. She's been teaching for 30 or 40 years, and she talks about how less is more in her experience. When she began to assign less reading, her students at Drexel got more out of what they read. Though neither she nor Mikic uses that term, as I say, the idea of a teachable moment comes to mind. I won't go into detail, but I want to quote two short paragraphs from Marantz-Cohen's essay. And she did this not because she was teaching online or because there was some kind of a crisis. It was just what she felt worked better teaching certain courses. I bypassed the long papers, midterms, and finals that generally punctuate a course of this kind, perhaps a survey course, for example. Instead, I required students to write at least a paragraph for every class session in response to the reading. They were encouraged to vary what they turned in, a paragraph when the work did not speak to them, more when it did. I sometimes graded their work and sometimes merely checked it, depending on whether there was enough substance there to warrant a grade. The importance of the assignment was not determined by me in advance, but by them. The shorter papers also made it easier to teach lessons in structure and style, and to wean students from the habit of empty verbiage. And I might add, maybe from the habit of plagiarism, from the habit of taking a lot of material from somewhere else. I have found myself doing what Cohen describes over my years at Rutgers Newark without even really thinking about it. And these habits serve one well in the present time, and serve one well when one is teaching a difficult canonical text to students who might not be planning to go into fields like philosophy or literature. There's a basic paradox here I'd like to point out. That slowness, the kind of slowness that Mikic advocates, the idea that less is more, the part for the whole, slowness also turns out to amount to speed and lightness, less empty verbiage. Keep the syllabus short and open to change, Cohen advises. I myself like to keep plenty of what I call air pockets in the syllabus, so that if you arrive at a moment when people have not done the reading or want to talk about the reading more, or where their last writing is a disaster and clearly needs what I call a writing clinic, there's time to do it. You're in charge of your syllabus, you and your students, and there should be time to be flexible. The puzzling partnership of slow and fast, read slowly but maybe teach fast, is mentioned in The Slow Professor, the Canadian book I referred to, where the authors note that paradoxically, during a slow class, time would fly, and we would all, teachers and students, be surprised that it was over so soon. Slow or fast? It's noteworthy that the issue, and this is a little sidebar about the history of teaching core curriculum courses or courses like your wonderful Great Work Certificate. When this began to be talked about at universities like Columbia nearly a century ago, the traditionalists who objected to teaching, say, Greek tragedy in translation to people who were not classicists, they said, how can you read a tragedy a week? How can you do justice to the grammar and so forth? When they had been used to reading very, very slowly with attention to grammar and every line. There's such a thing as teaching too slowly. When I myself was studying Greek tragedy at Harvard in the late 60s, we were reading Oedipus the King, one of the greatest plays ever written, and we didn't even finish that one play in a whole semester because we were looking at grammar. And that's the kind of issue that arose, say, in the 1920s and 30s at Columbia. So the old guard complained that the younger faculty were rushing and being too superficial. Some of these arguments are still taking place. Maybe you can teach too slowly, maybe you can teach too fast. Now, Professor Fott mentioned the Teagle Foundation, and someone who's connected to that foundation, Roosevelt Montas, who wrote a wonderful book called Rescuing Socrates, and who for years directed Columbia's core curriculum program, captures the paradox of trying to defend a liberal education and defend the study of literature, which can be seen by many as a waste of time. Back to time. Montas writes, the case for a liberal education is persistently hard to make. Part of the difficulty stems from the good that a liberal education delivers. Communicating its value typically demands an artificial compression, like pointing to the bottom line of a plot summary of a great novel. You can't really persuade somebody of the value of reading something unless they read it. In both cases, the value of the thing cannot be extracted and delivered apart from the experience of the thing. I don't think that's changed in 100 years. And I don't have a solution, but for the particular situation that we are talking about, which has its variations, but something in common, the idea of making hay slowly, feeling free to teach slowly, to stop at a particular line, or to speed up, or to skip something. So that's enough about time and the tools and techniques that both Mikic and Paula Morantz-Cohen talk about. And we'll turn to a couple of texts. I don't know that I'm going to read them all to you. These are lyric poems I like, and it's my good luck that I'm not a specialist in fiction. I've always thought that poems which are shorter and fit on a screen or fit in a handout are a lot easier to teach. And I'm always interested in how people teach fiction. I'm going to sort of rapidly run past a few poems. And poems can be approached in very, very many different ways. If a lyric poem is good, it will elicit many, many kinds of responses from students. And sometimes one image, one line, one metaphor will stop everyone. That's the way I experience reading poems. There's always something new and something else that stops me. I like a formulation by the Canadian critic Northrop Frye, who should be better remembered than he is. He says, if you stop a myth in its tracks, if you freeze a narrative and do a kind of a cross-section or freeze frame, you get a metaphor. If you stop a myth, like stopping a video, what you get is a frozen image, which is a metaphor. Narrative, in my view, tells what happened. Lyric tells how it felt. So I'm going to start with a poem by Cavafy, which should be next on your handout. It's called Walls, and it dates from 1896, translated from Greek by Edmund Keeley, a great translator and one of my teachers who died a month ago, actually today. And I will read Walls because it's short. With no consideration, no pity, no shame, they have built walls around me, thick and high. And now I sit here feeling hopeless. I can't think of anything else. This fate gnaws my mind because I had so much to do outside. When they were building the walls, how could I not have noticed? But I never heard the builders, not a sound. Imperceptibly, they have closed me off from the outside world. I can think of two, three experiences in my life when I read this poem and read it differently each time. In the 1970s, when I read it in Cavafy's Greek, I was interested in learning Greek as well as in appreciating Cavafy. Some 30 years later, when my late husband was ill with dementia, and I had, like many caregivers, sort of not noticed, almost intentionally or unconsciously denied this dreadful and worsening but subtle situation, I read the poem and it hit me very differently. I thought, how could I not have noticed that this dementia was building? Imperceptibly, it had closed me off as a caregiver from the outside world. And now in 2022, how can we not think about the pandemic and lockdown? There are many other private situations which we could apply to this poem, but there are three right there. Zooming on to another poem on your handout, The Subalterns, by the great poet Thomas Hardy, but not a particularly well-known poem of Hardy's. I include this here because it spoke to me, again, in my situation as living with someone with an incurable illness. That's how it seemed to me in around the year 2000. And again, since we're dealing with an invisible virus, which is a non-human agency, which is very hard to think about unless it is a human agency. There's an argument about that. The Subalterns is about various forces of nature, from the north wind to illness to death to a storm. Death is the last one. All of them are saying to the speaker, it's not my fault. I'm just following instructions. Subaltern means subordinate. So I'm just going to focus on the third stanza, where sickness, whatever sickness you want, plug in whatever illness you want, is speaking to the speaker of the poem. Tomorrow I attack thee, white means you creature, said sickness. Yet I swear I bear thy little ark, no spite, but am bid enter there. Sickness doesn't say what or who bids sickness to enter the human body. But what sickness is saying is, I'm just obeying something that I have to obey. So this is another poem that jumps over time at us. Text can escape or collapse or leap over time. We're back to time again. And I would guess that most of the works on the 9-page list that Professor Fott mentioned, whenever they were written and under whatever conditions, can speak to us now. That's why they're on that list. They can speak to students and teachers. They can speak to us at different times in our own lives and careers. I found myself teaching Thucydides on the plague of Athens to my literature and medicine students, for example. I'm not a Thucydides expert, but they're astounded by the relevance of that, for example. The aura of timelessness, particularly powerful in our Zoom world where we're kind of everywhere and nowhere, is a sense of spacelessness. You know, where am I? Where are you? And it might be the text that anchors us or that functions as a magnet pulling us together. One of my favorite poems, much too long to read, but I hope many of you know it, is Walt Whitman's Crossing Brooklyn Ferry. And speaking to readers of the future who will be reading him, I am with you, men and women of many generations hence. Whitman writes, it avails not, time nor place, distance avails not. That's uncanny and also, I think, very consoling. And I'm going to read a poem of my own, which should be next on your handout. It's called In the Cloud, and I wrote it late in 2020. And it's It's neither a complaint about teaching on Zoom nor praise of teaching on Zoom. I think all I was trying to do really was to keep track of this strange experience. So I will take the time to read this poem. In the Cloud. I made a list I can't find now. Where did all my folders go? Of words my students didn't know. Turmeric, poultice, fallacy, cadence, meringue, Antigone. Last but not least, Persephone are just a few that stick with me, plucked from the poems that we read. I tried to stay a week ahead between September and December. Many more I don't remember. But think of all the words they knew or thought they knew. I thought so too. Thinking too long, though, doesn't do. Words deeply pondered start to freeze, as when before our tired eyes, Zoom stalls and stops and no surprise, leaving a dark screen, a blank hour to fill with after and before. Nonsense syllables devour denotations. Happy, sad, joyful, or lonely, good or bad. What does this mean to you? I said. What does beautiful really mean? I asked them as I tried to lean into the non-committal screen, scanning until my eyes were sore for the soul in each black square. Were there really people there? Did each name hide a secret face, sheltering somewhere in place, some unimaginable space? Each word they may have learned from me in Gen Ed, reading poetry, carries its meaning quietly, concealed behind the livid glow of all we learned we didn't know. Alone together, here we are, stranded in our shared nowhere, marooned in space, while free from time, meanings proliferate and chime as words unfettered dance and rhyme. So that gives me my title, Marooned in Space and Free from Time. Rereading my poem now, I noticed the appearance, I guess serendipitous, of a couple of the slow reading techniques we looked at a few minutes ago. Make a list of words you don't know so you can look them up. Stop and ask what a word means, even a word like beautiful, which is familiar to everyone, but not easy to define. And I can't praise highly enough the technique of just stopping, saying, wait a minute, what does this mean? What did you mean just then? And that technique works at least as well, virtually, I would say. I'm going to look really quickly at the next two poems, not read the whole poem, just recommend them to you. Not necessarily because they're poems I recommend teaching, but because there's this same principle of timelessness and a kind of prophetic wisdom that lyric poems can have. They don't tell what happened. I sometimes think lyric poems remember the future and tell us what will happen. So there's a beautiful sonnet by Robert Frost, not a particularly fashionable poet these days, and it's not necessarily one of his best known poems. It's kind of medium famous Frost, called Never Again Would Birdsong Be the Same. And it's about, well, about the fact that the birds in the Garden of Eden learned something from listening to Eve. Let's see. I'm going to read you the first few lines and pause at one. He, and he is Adam, but we only know he is Adam because Eve is mentioned. He would declare and could himself believe that the birds there in all the garden round, from having heard the day-long voice of Eve, had added to their own an oversound, her tone of meaning, but without the words. Let's stop a minute on that line, her tone of meaning, but without the words. Robert Frost believed in what he called the sound of sense. He said, if you're listening to two people through a closed door and they're making love or they're fighting or having an argument, even if you can't make out the words, you can tell the tone of meaning without the words. What happens when we flip that and we have the words without the tone of meaning? Well, the next Frost poem, it should be on your handout, is called The Most of It. And it's, again, not one of his best known poems. It's about loneliness. It's about a person in a world with no other people. Maybe he's the last living person. Maybe he's the first person. Maybe he's just lost in the wilderness. We don't know. But in the middle of The Most of It is, well, I will read as far, I will start with the beginning and then stop with that line that always stops me. He thought he kept the universe alone, for all the voice in answer he could wake was but the mocking echo of his own from some tree-hidden cliff across the lake. Some morning from the boulder-broken beach, he would cry out on life that what it wants is not its own love back in copy speech, but counter-love, original response. It's pretty remarkable. He would cry out on life that what it wants is not its own love back in copy speech, but counter-love, original response. This lonely person with no other people, he kept the universe alone, wants counter-love, original response. He wants a dialogue. He does not want an echo, and he does not want some sort of AI copy speech. And if you think about the phrase, her tone of meaning, but without the words, which is we get the emotional heft of another voice, even if we don't get the words. And then we have something like the opposite here. We have a sort of a machine copy speech. Frost was very interested in the human voice and how it communicated. So that might be a place where I would pull those lines out and just ask students to think about them. So one reason that people get angry at each other, at other people with emails and texts, is that there is no tone of meaning. There's just words on a screen. I don't know what Frost would have said about that. And when people unintentionally forward an email to too many people, maybe that's copy speech, thinking about that. So we've looked at time, we've looked at tools and techniques, and we've looked at a very, very small number of poems. But I would tend to think that any good poem is worth looking at slowly and quickly, pulling out a line if need be, asking the students, maybe this is something Helen Vendler has recommended, take your favorite few lines and write them out, look up the words. There are all kinds of things that you can do. Write a poem imitating what the poet is doing. So we're finally arriving at pleasure, and I am near the end of my talk, and then I'm going to read a couple of pages from a little essay I wrote last spring, and then we're done, and I'll take questions. So before I get into a short discussion of pleasure, I want to recommend again that whether you're Zooming or WebExing or whatever, have other voices in the classroom, and that means guest lecturers or even maybe students who have taken the class a year or two before. The students, your students will have something else to look at, someone else to listen to, some other take. Now, again, that hardly seems to need saying. It's so obvious, but I am sometimes surprised that more of my colleagues don't take advantage of having guests. You don't have to have a lot of famous colleagues to invite someone in. Somebody will have something to say. Okay, so let's move to a writer who, like Frost, for example, like Thomas Hardy, is listed on, and like Whitman, certainly is listed on your wonderful canonical list here. Wallace Stevens has a poem called Notes Toward a Supreme Fiction, and roughly by supreme fiction, Stevens, a great American poet who died in 1955, by supreme fiction, he meant something like imagination or art. And he has, it's an interesting title, isn't it, for a poem, Notes Toward a Supreme Fiction, as if he was giving a lecture. He has 3 criteria, which are the separate sections of his long poem. It, by it meaning the supreme fiction, must be abstract, it must change, and it must give pleasure. And we might think about what those 3 criteria mean. Abstract, I take in a very simple way, maybe like an abstract painting, not limiting itself to a literal depiction of reality. Um, we might pause, this is a little topical parenthesis. Sometimes people who attack the study of imaginative literature, attack the study of literature in courses like the ones that exist in your program and many other programs, they attack this because the literature is not real or not true, and therefore is a waste of time and irrelevant. And such attacks just show a pretty limited sense of what art is and what the imagination is. In other words, why read about someone in pain when you can take a course in medicine, something like that? One sees these criticisms in print. I mention it for that reason. Okay, the second criterion is change. Change can mean a lot of things, but I think one thing it turns out to mean for me is every time I experience a major work of art or a work of literature or philosophy, I experience it differently. It changes for me, as the Cavafy poem, as the Thomas Hardy poem did, as in a way the Frost poems did. And then finally, pleasure. The pleasure of art, the pleasure of making art, experiencing art, discussing it quickly or slowly, puzzling out together. All of these kinds of pleasure can cluster together in the shared enterprise of teaching and studying literature. And by teaching, I don't mean only Zoom or WebEx, and by literature, I don't mean only poems. But since we're on WebEx and that's what we're talking about, we can focus on literature. And I think that the amount of pleasure is not to be discounted. I like noticing that students who have been brought up on screens actually like notebooks and pens. They like to write, they like to read, they like books. That gives me a certain amount of hope. So in terms of pleasure, I'm going to close by reading you about 2 pages of a brief essay I wrote last April about the experience of teaching the Odyssey, which is certainly a text on your list, slowly and remotely. And I decided early on that there was no reason to rush. We would read the Odyssey in its entirety and we would read it slowly. And the essay is called The Cruise. It's in your handout. And a couple of friends who read it said, oh, gee, I wish I could take a Mediterranean cruise with my students. This was not a Mediterranean cruise. This was a metaphorical cruise, an abstract cruise. Not pleasurable in the sense that we had a hilarious time all the time, but there was a kind of an attentiveness and expansiveness. We moved along. We had a lot of guest lecturers. Everyone had a chance to approach the poem in their own way. And maybe some of the Odyssey stuck. What about what stays with you when you have been reading slowly or teaching fast? Robert Frost commented once that his aim was to lodge a few poems where they would be hard to get rid of, like Splinters Under Your Nails or Blackberry Seeds Between Your Teeth, but lodge a few poems where they'd be hard to get rid of. And Paul Morantz Cohen writes, even though I read a great deal when I was in college, what I remember of my reading tends to be certain passages here and there, often those that spark discussion in class. In other words, a passage that stopped time and then people took the time to look at it. So the essay is going to be talking or speaking to some of the points I've made, the strange flow of time, guest lectures, the ability to sort of stop and think. And with the end of the lecture, I'm going to end. And it's been a pleasure speaking to you, and I hope there are some questions. The epigraph to my essay is from a poem by the great modern Greek poet George Seferis, who won the Nobel Prize, I think in 1968. He has a long poem, which is kind of a rewriting of the Odyssey. And he says, we put to sea again with our broken oars. We put to sea again with our broken oars. That's a great image of the perpetual effort to start up again. And I'll say more about that. The ship was still becalmed, or had we barely begun to move? You students and I sat or lounged on the deck in little clusters. It was hard to maintain distance. Guest lecturers, one or two of them some weeks, clambered out of their mythical lives, their caves beneath the sea, their specialized islands, to visit us and generously shared an hour with us. I could only pay them for their time with maple syrup. Rutgers's funds were all frozen. My parting guest gift. To pay for time, but maybe time was cheap. Didn't we all have it in abundance? The students struggling with assignments and deadlines might have a different take on time from mine. Still, I wasn't paying or not paying for time. I was paying or not for knowledge, for wisdom, for pleasure. The lecturers dried themselves in the sun and sat down with us and told us stories, many secondary stories sprouting, ramifying from the one primal story we've been sailing through all semester. Some of their stories came from the province of philology, zeroing in on words that chimed with other words and looped into chains of images and ideas. Natasha Bershadsky pointed out to us the twitching feet of the hanged maids caught like thrushes in a net, and other birds and animals in extremis. Amit Duga linked the bow, the lyre, and the loom, all frames with strings, all held in the hand, all requiring practice, skill, and precision to master and use, and all provoking weeping. Diane Svarlin unpacked a couple of similes from Book 5 and set us on the scent of more similes. Gregory Nage answered a question about Calypso by reminding us that her ill-omened name signified covering something with earth. I will bury you. Some of the speakers stood back and looked at bigger, less literary patterns of hospitality, of gift-giving, of meat-eating. A.E. Stallings considered the Odyssey as fan fiction. Meet your favorite heroes again in the underworld. See, but don't try to embrace the holograms of the people you knew in life. Moira Egan offered a crown of sonnets, spoken as if in group therapy by the various naughty ladies, as she called them, of the Odyssey. We listened entranced, or at least I was entranced. How can one ever speak for one's students? All these guests were my friends from various layers of my now long and deep past life, who gifted us with their knowledge and asked nothing of return. A student in my other class, someone who rarely spoke, had captured with elegant economy the mood, the weather, the condition of the time we're living through. The pandemic, she had blogged, has made all our lives blurry. We closed our blurry eyes, or at least I did, and faced the westering sun. Walt Whitman wasn't here with us on the deck, or was he? Here are his words in Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, and these are worth quoting again, about the strangely unbounded world he sensed as he crossed the East River around 1855, in the same state of unboundedness we find ourselves in. It avails not time nor place, distance avails not. I am with you, you men and women of a generation, or ever so many generations hence. It's the very vagueness of temporal boundaries that seems to abolish space and let everyone in, or else it's Zoom technology, or both. And that vagueness provides its own kind of consolation, its own special encouragement of undreamed of possibilities. Each lecturer faded magically back into their illegible life, and we sailed on. Sailed, sail. Were we beginning to move, or was it only an illusion? The bag of winds was tightly stoppered. Is, was. Watch your verb tenses, I always tell my students. Use the present tense when you're writing about literature. Stories, on the other hand, narratives of something that happened to you, usually do better in the past tense. Usually. But the narrative of this cruise, maybe not so past, maybe eternal present. On we go. You, like dutiful students when asked to ask questions, came up with questions. Why doesn't God X just kill mortal Y and get it over with? How much power do the gods have, and what are the limits of their power? And then the thorny issues of fidelity, adultery, gender politics, the overwhelming problem of fate. What about all these? Your questions floated in the chat in the salty air and drifted out to sea. No wind, there was no knowing. The lecturer fell silent, so did we. The lecture was over, the class was over, the semester was almost over. Maybe the pandemic was almost over. There was no knowing. And the story? Salty, deep, unfathomably old. The story had no need of listeners, but wave-like rolled on and on. Except that that's not true. Stories need listeners to stay alive. Doesn't the story tell us that the dead must drink warm blood before they speak? And also, we all need stories. I do, and you, Tyrese, you, Janelle, you, John, you, Blessing, you, Karen, you, Chris L. and Chris J. You need stories, and also you are living in and through your own individual stories. And you, and you, and you. I hope you will remember this story in the future. The future, another problematic verb tense, as it retells, unspools itself through you. The story of the Odyssey and of our cruise through it, after the cruise is over, after the ship has docked. So I will stop here and have a drink of water, and I will look in the chat for your questions. And if I have trouble with that, I'll ask David to help me. Thank you so much for your good attention.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Professor Hadas, for that
So,
very interesting talk. Um, Let me encourage you to type your question into the chat feature. Professor Hadas will be able to see it, or if for some reason she can't see it, we'll be sure that it is relayed to her. So please type your question into the chat feature. Uh, I'll begin by asking a question, and that is that students have different ways to approach poetry. And isn't it one of the instructor's jobs to learn what those styles, what those approaches are, and to appeal to those styles in teaching? But isn't that much more difficult in this age of Zoom when you're doing the teaching online? How do you go about getting to know your students and the way they approach poetry when you're teaching online?
well, as Paula Morantz Cohen says in her 2010 essay, she was asking students to respond with either a paragraph or more to everything they read. And that's actually, if anything, easier online. You know, there are platforms like Canvas or Blackboard, there are discussion posts. And I don't think it's necessarily harder. Sometimes it's easier for students to write something down, and then you can work with what they've written. Sometimes in the pre-Zoom days, I would ask people to write a question on an index card, and then I would have people write the questions on the blackboard. Group work is another thing. Another idea is there are many, many ways that poetry has been approached by literature professors, and you can take a single poem and use a number of different tools and see which one works. So those are some answers I have. It's not always easy. There might be all kinds of resistance and problems, in which case you might want to move on, or you might want to make a teachable moment out of it. Poems, students are often curious to learn about the poet. Well, certainly they can Google information very easily. Some schools of thought, like the so-called new criticism, say the point is not the poet or the time when the poem was written. The point is the words on the page. Sometimes that works. So I don't know. Those are a few ideas I have.
But it must be especially hard when the students' cameras are turned off, as they so often are when they're online. I know from my own experience with students, very few of the students have their cameras turned on for whatever reason, whether it's a poor internet connection or uncertain conditions at home where they are. That's a challenge too.
And I like to ask them to turn their cameras on sometimes, although I don't think Rutgers allows me to
Mhm.
require it because there's all kinds of considerations of privacy. But you know, there are breakout rooms, there are different things that can be done. And going back to my idea of oh, here's a nice long question. Wow, from
Yeah.
John. Going back to my idea of guest lecturers, the last time I taught a poetry course in the fall of 2020, I had maybe 5 or 6 poets, all people I know. I know a lot of poets, and 1 or 2 of them were former students of mine. So they ranged in age from about 30 to about my age, a very diverse group. And with each poet who visited, I asked the poet to talk to the class about what poetry meant to them personally, how they had come to poetry, and would they give the class a snapshot of American poetry right now at this moment. So even if the students had their cameras off, um, that's okay. They could be quiet. I don't know how big your classes are, Professor Fott. I mean, I like small classes. I think this might be harder with a very large class. So I sympathize, but I think one has to try. Let's see. I'm okay. Here comes some questions.
Yes, here's a question from Professor Hay. You see the
Okay.
question from Professor Hay?
I just wanted to say in the chat that Arij Qureshi was a student of mine at Rutgers Newark, and it's great that
Oh yeah.
she's, yeah. Hi, Arij. Nice to see. Even though your camera is off, nice. She was a an MA student, and then she went on to get an MFA, and now she's getting a PhD. Okay, Claudia had to go off to teach. All right, let me read your question, Professor Hay.
Yes, maybe I should read it
Okay, sure.
for our audience online. Professor Hayes says, "Thank you for this wonderful talk. I especially appreciate your reflections on Kafavi's poem, how it took on a whole new meaning for you nearly 50 years after you had first read it. I vividly recall taking a Shakespeare course in my first semester of college with an emeritus professor in his 80s. He told us that he had only recently, after the passing of his wife and some difficulties with his adult children, begun to realize the power of King Lear. This made a big impression on me because the professor was telling us that he didn't begin to appreciate the play we were reading until he was 80 years old. So I wonder about how best to convey this feeling to students. How can we convince them that the power of a poem or text may not be apparent for years or even decades? How do we, in the immediate present, try to convey that value that takes so much time to flourish?
It's a great question. I'm not sure we have to. I mean, I think what we could do is do what this professor did and say, this poem didn't mean much to me when I first read it, but it means a lot to me now. And here's what it means to me now. And just suggest to the students that a classic, if you want to use that word, or a great work of literature is something that will remain fresh and keep changing. And I don't think you can necessarily do more than that, but you can help them to remember that class. After all, Professor Hay remembered that class with the 80-year-old professor. And I'm sure he's read King Lear many times. So if I were teaching Cavafy, I might ask them to write the poem out in their notebook or to come up with a metaphor. It's also a wonderful metaphor. The poem could be read literally, but it asks to be read metaphorically. So do an imitation of the Cavafy, or write, what does that metaphor mean to you? Or something like that. But I don't think you can't say to a student, you'll see in 50 years, this will have changed for you. You can just say, I think it might, you know?
Would it help to try to make them imagine themselves in a particular situation that they're likely to be in a few years from now, or maybe many years even toward the end of their life? to use their imagination, uh,
Yeah.
yeah, to imagine a situation in which then the poem might have great meaning for them. Yeah.
Absolutely. I'll probably think of a better answer to Professor Hayes' question later. So, I mean, something is sliding out of my mind right now, but maybe other people have ideas that they could put in the chat. I mean, it's a great question. And I think part of teaching anything, probably not only literature, is somewhat performative. If you seem bored or uninterested by what you're teaching, the students will pick up on that right away.
Hmm.
So, you know, make sure that what you're teaching is something you want to teach and like teaching. Margaret Harp is asking everyone about, you want to read that question, David?
Sure, sure.
Professor,
Yes, I'll be happy to. This is Professor Margaret Harp, who teaches French at UNLV. Thank you for your talk. I teach French literature in French. Our sessions often do focus on particular words, and just as you have mentioned, students often remember the richness of passages where the terms are found. Do you have suggestions for teaching a poem in another language?
well, I haven't taught poems in other languages maybe for years, or except for a few poems in a translation course where the focus is on different ways of translating, say, Sappho or Catullus or Homer or something like that. But I think Professor Harp could speak better than I could to that. But I think that, for example, if there's a great poem, let's say a poem by Baudelaire, whether the students know French or not, it's always good to compare, take 3 or 4 different translations of a poem, of one poem, and they can compare and see how um, each translation solves certain problems differently, but also falls short. My own doctorate from Princeton is in comparative literature, and I've always thought any study of literature has to be comparative. You're always looking at more than one thing. And I like to tell the students, just the way you can't really judge a baseball game or a tennis player unless you're comparing that tennis player's style to some other tennis player's style, it's always helpful to group things. So perhaps a poem in French could be put next to a poem in English, or perhaps I'm just thinking of a little smorgasbord of translations. I'm in a reading group right now just for fun where we're reading Ovid's Metamorphoses, and we started out reading one translation, but we're quickly bringing in more. And that way you learn more about everything. You learn more about Ovid, about the Latin, about the styles of translation in different times. So I guess I would sum up by saying to Professor Harp, bring in something else.
uh, Literalness of translation may be more difficult to justify in poetry than in prose.
Oh yeah, oh
Uh,
yeah,
right, but don't you need? I mean, but where a poet is careful in her or his use of a particular word, you know, as great poets always are, doesn't the reader need to know, look, this word, this is the same word in French, even though it may be translated in English in different
yeah.
ways? Isn't that
Oh,
essential to appreciating a poem?
and I think that, you know, even if somebody were teaching a poem in a language many of the students didn't know, maybe Arabic or maybe Portuguese or maybe Chinese, if they could just zoom in on one line even and really look at that line. I've sometimes pulled lines out of context. For example, the great Roman poet Lucretius, who is also on your 9-page list, I think, has a great line about how dangerous religion is. And you can scoop a line out of context. You know, context can be important, but sometimes context is not so important. And in
Hmm.
a way, the 80-year-old professor that Professor Hay was mentioning was sort of taking King Lear out of context. He was saying, this is what it means to me at this moment in my life. and he was being very personal, and he was making himself vulnerable, but I think it was worth it. I think it was memorable. I don't know if
That's
there are any other questions.
that's difficult for many instructors to do, I think,
Yeah.
to bring their personal lives in. Uh,
I, I think it gets easier as you get. For me, it's gotten easier as I've gotten older. Maybe I don't know. That's an interesting question. And obviously, teachers have their own style of teaching. I remember reading years ago that you it's sort of like being a coach. You could be very encouraging and constantly giving positive feedback to your students, or uh, you could be very strict and stern, and students can actually flourish under both kinds of teachers if the chemistry is right.
mhm.
So yeah, I think yeah, it's not always easy, and maybe not every subject is personal, but I know there's a very beautiful passage in the Iliad where Hector and Andromache are essentially saying goodbye to each other, and um, Andromache holds up the baby, and the baby is frightened by Hector's helmet, and Hector has to take his helmet off before the baby recognizes his father. It's an unbelievably moving passage, and I read somewhere that you could teach the grammar of the passage or the mythology, but you still would want to cry when you taught it. I think that maybe that's one of the lessons a student can learn, that, a grown up can be moved by something. Some old grown up standing in front of the class can still have some emotions. I don't know. It's an individual thing.
We're not all cynics.
Right, exactly,
Right.
exactly,
Yes.
exactly.
Yes.
And I think
Uh,
it's okay. I think it's fine to refer to your own tastes. I mean, I will say to my students, William Carlos Williams is kind of a blind spot of mine, but let's see what we can do. Or
hmm.
something you just said made me appreciate William Carlos Williams more than I ever did before, or something
Hmm.
like that.
Do you go out of your way to teach those poets you consider to be blind spots?
No, it would depend on the course, but I don't go out of my way to avoid them either.
Uh-huh. Yes. Yes.
I don't know if, I don't know if what I've said is helpful to people who are not teaching poetry. I'd love to hear from other people who are teaching other kinds of literature.
Are there students who are so used to reading prose, and let's face it, I mean, not a lot of today's college students read poetry for pleasure, not as much as they
Yeah.
used to. I think that's a safe statement. How do you how do you handle the student who has a hard time with poetry in general? Is so used to prose that poetry, all poetry, even in English, seems just like a foreign language.
There's been a lot of attention to that question because it's a frequently asked question. There's a good new book by David Kirby, a poet who teaches at the University of Florida at Gainesville, called The Knowledge: What Makes Poems Work, How to Read Them and How to Write Them. I mean, I think any textbook of poetry or textbook of poetics is going to address that question. I don't have a magic formula. I think sometimes students like poems because they're short and because they're often about emotion. I say narrative is what happened and poetry is how it feels. And we're living in a very large, impersonal, bureaucratic society in many ways. And poetry is a place like music for young people to put a lot of emotions. If you have a breakup with your boyfriend or your girlfriend, or a parent or grandparent dies, or a friend dies of COVID, you're most likely to write a poem and not prose.
Mhm.
So I don't find that that students hate poetry so much. But one other answer to that is that I like to make a distinction between the what and the how. Okay, so what would be the idea or the theme, a word that was very popular when I was in high school. What is the theme of this poem? And that kind of reading only takes you so far. It takes you toward paraphrase and summary as if the poem was an editorial in a newspaper. Um, how is style, voice, the various uses of the language? And I like to say, I'm happy to see another question from John Hay. The um, the what of a lot of great poems is extremely simple. I love you, I'm sad, it's winter time, somebody died, it's spring, I'm happy, I'm angry. So the how is extremely important. The how is more important than the what in poetry, and I think they get that. Um, so those are some of my answers. Also, my students might be self-selected. I don't teach that many courses where I only teach poetry. I teach a course in mythology. So Homer comes in, Greek tragedy comes in, but it doesn't have to be all poetry. I teach a course in literature and medicine. Poetry is just a small amount of what we read. So I think that poets should be able to read other kinds of work for sure, and maybe begin to think about the distinction between poetry and other kinds of writing. Do I try to incorporate?
Yes.
No,
Well,
in a word, John, no, I don't.
yes.
But I,
The
yeah,
question from Professor Hay again is, do you try to incorporate popular song lyrics into
yeah.
your poetry courses? Is that something students especially want or respond to favorably?
Um, I think they would respond favorably if I did. I think what I would probably rather do is ask them to bring it in because they're more familiar with it. Bob Dylan, yeah, some Bob Dylan poetry is very rich in wit and allusion. There's a book by Christopher Ricks, perhaps Professor Hay knows it, about Bob Dylan. Although he might not be a great poet, Bob Dylan's been a great reader, so his poetry is very rich in allusion and echo and parody and so forth. Anyway, it's a very interesting question because the whole idea of lyric poetry, going back to the Greeks, lyric poetry was sung, it was performed to the lyre. And a great deal of music that students listen to is poetry set to music. It might not be the greatest poetry, but it's poetry. I'm too old to try to keep up with the music that the students like. So there are certain advantages in getting older. You know, I try to teach them something that I know that they don't know, but there's room to learn for them as well. One student said to me that she always had a playlist whenever she was writing poetry herself. So her own poetry is extremely influenced by music. And this is an MFA poetry student, but that's an interesting thing. And many poets have listened to music while they're writing. Hart Crane would be an example. I think that there's many ways of doing it that work. And you have to find out as a teacher what works and what doesn't work. And I know that the blank screen that Professor Fott was talking about can be very challenging. There's no question. I find that Zoom classes tend to be shorter. I mean, let's see, I've been on for an hour and 10 minutes. It's probably enough. I found when I was first teaching on Zoom that at the end of a Zoom class, I was hungry as if I'd been hiking up a mountain. It seemed to take a lot of energy. So I don't know how it's going to be teaching next fall in the classroom. I'm doing a little bit of both right now, and that's strange too, but it makes me appreciate both. I appreciate being in class with them, and then I appreciate what Zoom is letting us do. And I don't think that these remote technologies are really going away. It'll be interesting to see. And that's really another topic. I mean, there are teachers who claim that WebEx has given them the greatest teaching experiences of their lives, and other teachers who say the opposite. I think really the returns aren't in yet. And I'd be interested, in your own experience, the professors who are here, how has it been for you teaching remotely?
Yes, you hear you hear there's an old saw that students have different learning styles, and then
Right.
every now and then people will come up with research to say no, they don't. Really, actually, all students learn fundamentally in the same way,
Interesting.
but the different experiences that instructors and students have with online learning might tend to support the belief that there are different learning styles. Uh,
I think so.
you know,
I think so. And I think also a teaching style changes over the years. I'm probably somewhat a different teacher than I was when I started teaching at Rutgers, my God, in 1981. So that's something we could all look at too. And I think that the idea of pausing and the idea of an air pocket in a syllabus can just apply to the teacher. If you feel that something you're doing isn't working, that the students are resisting, or that the students maybe are really not liking something that they're reading, or that there's a problem, it's hard to do, but I think it's better to stop and sort of investigate. I've had conversations with colleagues where somebody might say, well, the students are really struggling to write. And I say, well, why don't you devote a class to working on writing? Oh, no, I can't do that because we have to cover blah, 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 blah. And that just seems short-sighted to me. It's more important to deal with the problems that have to be dealt with.
I
So,
think
and that's, yeah, that's easier if it's a small class, for example.
Sure. I think you're right, and I think it's difficult in these days when syllabi are almost looked at as contracts between instructor and student for the
Yeah,
instructor to think about changing the syllabus in midstream.
yeah.
But uh, if one looks back at the great university courses of decades ago, they were
Right.
taught by instructors who knew when to start, when to speed up, and when to slow down. Yes.
I
Here's,
think it, go
I'm
ahead.
sorry. No, I was just
No.
going to read the comment from Professor Harp, but um, Professor Harp notes, I was grateful to have the technology, but I never felt the same kind of connection as I do in the classroom, particularly in my language skills courses. The surprise is the students who adamantly prefer the in-class format.
Well, that must be a nice feeling. I mean, when I first read the comment in the chat, I thought it was going to be the surprises the students who adamantly prefer the remote format.
I did too.
It's nice that they prefer the in class, and I think with a language skills course, well, I know there are many high-tech language labs, but I do think that there are topics that are lend themselves more to remote teaching. And when you're reading something fairly short, like a lyric poem, it can be posted online, people can read it, people can write responses to it. So I think it works fairly well for me, but I think, lyric poems are short. There's a wonderful program in New York and in other cities called Poetry in Motion, where you can be on a bus or a subway. I know they have this in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and you look up and there's a poem. And or that's easy to do with poetry. It's harder to do with a novel, for example. So poetry lends itself to short attention spans, for example, which we're certainly dealing with right now. But yeah, I think being back in the room with the students is, I was teaching in person yesterday and I was meeting with students one-on-one about their papers. I grabbed an empty classroom so we could sit just two of us. And that made, I think, everybody feel good. And then I'm going back to teaching remotely tomorrow with more of a sense of who my students are individually.
Yes. Poetry on the bus, right? Yes, that can work. If it's prose, you need something about the scale of the Lincoln Memorial. I think to put that.
Unless, unless it's a really short aphoristic piece of prose, which then approaches a poem. You could have a Zen koan or something by Heraclitus or something, and that seems a lot like a poem. I think I should also say that we're living in a time in the literary world, and some of my colleagues in the MFA program at Rutgers would certainly agree with this, that the genres are kind of blurry. So fiction and nonfiction are beginning to blur. and poetry and prose often blur. A lot of poetry that's written right now seems to me to be very, very prosaic. And if the students don't like it, it might be because there's not very much musical there. There's not very much to hold on to and enjoy and remember. That's me, maybe. But definitely we're living in a time when genres are bending. There's something called a lyrical memoir. You know, it used to be it's fiction or it's nonfiction. It's not so easy anymore. And I like to say that poetry is a continuum. At one end, you have, say, a Shakespeare sonnet, and at the other end, moving away from poetry, you might have the instructions on a box of brownies or something. And I say to the students, if the instructions on a box of brownies rhymed, how would you feel? And you know, you would be surprised and distracted. You don't expect that on the instructions on a box of brownies. So many things to say about this. Any other questions? I probably should disappear in the next few minutes. I think we've probably all been online for a long time here.
Well, I don't see any other questions, so perhaps we'll sign off. Professor Hadas, thank you very much. This has been a wonderful talk and enlightening, and we can hope that the pandemic will be over soon for the sake of our collective health and individual health. And as you say, where that will leave us in the use of technology remains to be seen. So we
And
leave
I just put my
in a
email
moment
in
of
the chat.
uncertainty.
I'm very
Yes,
happy to. If, I myself often find it difficult to come up with questions right after a talk. So if you would like to share something, that's fine. I should say, full disclosure here, that I'm on the advisory board of the Teagle Foundation, and that on April 21st, I think Professor Hay or Professor Fott can give you more information, but I will be in an online conversation with the wonderful American poet Major Jackson. Oops, I put Jackson Major. His name is Major Jackson. He teaches at Vanderbilt. And this is one of a series of transformative text talks sponsored by the Teagle Foundation. So Major and I will be chatting back and forth for an hour, 12:30 Eastern Time, about how we teach poetry in the classroom. And I'm happy to give more information, but if you just Google the Teagle Foundation Cornerstone Initiative.
yes. Learning for living, I believe. It's
Yeah,
the corner.
right.
The
Professor Bob would know all about it. Yeah.
the project is the Cornerstone Project, and we are particularly grateful for that project here at the Great Works Academic Certificate Program because we have received a grant to promote the teaching of these core transformative texts at UNLV. That's what we're engaged in doing right now, and Professor Hadas is involved with this project as one of the advisors for the Cornerstone project, which is a wonderful project. Um, and I would
It's
say that even if our program had not received a grant, it's a great initiative.
project, and I'm very
Teagle,
excited to be part of it. Late in my career, you know, I mean, I'm a poet, I'm a critic, but I think that teaching these texts is extremely important, and I'm delighted to be involved in this. And I'm very happy to have had the opportunity to speak to all of you. So thank you so much, and I
and
hope we can all navigate with our broken oars, as Seferis puts it, and keep on going. So thanks a lot. I guess I just press the X at the bottom here?
thank you. I think that's what we do. So thank you again,
That's
Professor Haddis.
I'll do. Thank you so much, everybody. Bye bye.